The Council of Three Hammers, Fire and Iron, a short story by Matt Burns, Part 2. Kurdran elbowed through the last line of dwarves and emerged in the high seat. The chamber, home to Ironforge's regency, was like the rest of the city, dim and shadowy, with high metallic stone walls illuminated in the glow of hanging lamps. At the back of the room, atop a raised platform, were the three identical thrones of the Council of Three Hammers. A chill went through Kurdran as his eyes locked with the middle throne, once that of King Magni. When Kurdran had joined the council, Magni's brother, Moradin, had taken him to the lower depths of the ancient city. There, Kurdran had seen an image that would haunt his dreams. Magni transformed into a diamond statue. The petrification had happened while the king had been performing a mystic ritual to commune with the earth and glean answers as to the troubling quakes, storms, and other calamities befalling the world at the time. Now Moradin stood at the central throne. Kurdran glanced at the bronze-bearded dwarf, who glared back balefully. It was a far cry from the jovial welcome that he had given Kurdran upon entering the city. In his first days on the council, Kurdran had shared many pints of ale with Muradin and recounted his tales of Outland, while the Bronzebeard had told of his own adventures in the frozen continent of Northrend. As the days had worn on, Muradin had grown cold to Kurdran for reasons that the Wildhammer did not understand. To Muradin's right stood Moira Tharisin, Magni's daughter. Despite having devastated her father by marrying into the Bronzebeard clan's former rivals, the Dark Irons, she was the legal heir to Ironforge, as was her smaller toddler, Dagran, who was rocking idly in a crib at Moira's feet. The Harris, her hair drawn up in perfect buns, bowed slightly to Kurdran. "Welcome, Kurdran." "Aye," was all Kurdran said. He marched past a wooden table standing at the bottom of the ramp to the thrones. On the table were two artifacts that had, in the past week, stirred the simmering cauldron of Ironforge into a torrent: a gnarled wooden staff with a deep, violent gem set in it, and a scarred, warped hammerhead. Kurdran grimaced at the sight of the relics and took his place at the throne to Muradin's left. Not for the first time since he had come to Ironforge to rule alongside Moira and Muradin, he felt out of place. The council was thick with Bronzebeard and due to Dagran, Dark Iron blood, but not on Kurdran's side of the thrones. The voices at the entrance to the high seat died down, and Advisor Belgrum, a wizened dwarf standing at the foot of the platform, bowed. Two younger historians standing nearby mirrored Belgrum's gesture of respect. One of them was a short Wildhammer dwarf dressed in a bright red tunic, a very thorough fact-checker by all accounts. Belgrum straightened and shuffled forward. "Welcome, Thane Kurdran. I take it you've made your decision?" Kurdran took in the room. Everything was the same as it had been in recent days. The same question, the same crowd of bickering dwarves, the same feeling of being concerned. On each previous occasion he had answered Belgrum the same way. No. Yet just last night, a Wildhammer and a Bronzebeard had been killed during a petty brawl concerning the scepter in Kurdran's hands. "I didn't think I have a choice," Kurdran replied. "Ah," Muradin sighed. "How many times are you going to go on about—" "Kurdran," Moira interrupted, "of the three of us, it is you who have the most to sacrifice. If you choose to keep your piece of the hammer, we will forego what we have planned." Kurdran's attention shifted to a tattered scroll in Belgrum's aged and trembling fist. The parchment, discovered in Ironforge's library a week prior, depicted parts of the Dwarven Civil War centuries past. As the story went, when the High King of Ironforge, Monimus Anvilmar, had died, the clans had battled for control of the city. In the process, Monimus's weapon, the Hammer of the High King, had mysteriously disappeared. Over the years, Kurdran had heard his share of rumors regarding what had become of the hammer. The parchment put an end to the speculation. It said that Monimus's hammer had been broken into 3 pieces. During the chaos of the war, each clan had, in one way or another, managed to obtain one of the fragments. Faced with the uncertain future of Ironforge, Curdran surmised. The dwarves foolishly saw mending the hammer as a path to peace, or simply an outlet for their old rivalries and animosity. Curdran shook his gaze from the scroll. "I've made me decision," he yelled, lifting the iron scepter in his hands. "This heirloom has been part of the Wildhammer clan for centuries. I joined this council to maintain peace and not argue over reforging an old hammer." Angry shouts rose from the shifting mass of stout dwarven onlookers. The hammer was Monimus's to begin with. It belongs to the city. If the Wildhammers didn't want peace, they didn't belong on the council. Curdran looked on, agitated, as the throng closed in on the few Wildhammer dwarves in the crowd just as armed guards were rushing in to quell the unrest. "But one of me clansmen is now dead because of this hammer," Curdran bellowed over the clamor. "I'll not have it happen again." He squeezed the Wildhammer scepter in his hand one last time and set it down on the wooden table, alongside the other artifacts with a hollow thud. The crowd went silent. Belgrim nodded and raised his hands to everyone present. "So it is, by decree of the council, the great hammer of Monimus Anvilmar, last Eye King of Ironforge, will be reforged." A roar of applause rose from the dwarves in attendance, and Curdran scowled. "As ye now see," Belgrim continued, "from the Wildhammers comes the handle of Monimus's hammer, taken by one of the clan and reforged into a scepter carried by Thane Curdran, and before him Thane Kadros." Curdran eyed the scepter. Its size and shape were slightly different from the description of the hammer handle in the parchment. He remembered asking Kadros years ago where the scepter had come from. The elder dwarf had simply replied that the heirloom's past was not important. Its significance lay only in what had become. Curdran had always viewed the Thane's ambiguous explanation as one of his usual philosophical musings, perhaps even a metaphor for the Wildhammer clan. Now he wondered if it had been Kadros who had taken the handle and reshaped it, never speaking of its origins again. Belgrim gestured to the deformed hammerhead atop the wooden table. "From the Bronzebeards comes the head of Monimus's hammer, damaged beyond recognition in a fire during the Civil War, intended to end the city's library along with other debris gathered in memory of the conflict." Then Belgrim extended a hand to the gnarled staff adjacent to the hammerhead. "And from the Dark Irons comes the once golden-hued crystal that had been set to the head of Monimus's hammer, found by one of the clan's sorcerers and altered in color to hide its identity." Loud erratic applause issued forth from the Dark Irons in attendance. "The forging will begin 3 days from now. For the time being, the council asks that ye go about your business as it chooses who will reforge the pieces," Belgrim said. The onlookers slowly dissipated, picking up their fiery arguments where they had left off as though the meeting had never happened. Curdran stared hard at the Wildhammer scepter resting on the wooden table. A troubling question ate him. What more, in the weeks and months to come, would Ironforge strip away from him and his clan? Without a word, he descended from the stone platform and strode towards the exit of the high seat. "Curdran," Moira called after him with concern, "we have yet to decide who will forge the hammer." "It doesn't matter," Curdran growled as he left the room. Curdran strolled beside Skyrie past rows of apartments and merchant shops at the outer ring of the city, where the sound of hammer striking anvil from the great forge was only a faint echo. The cloud of age was thick in the griffin's eyes, and the slowness of her gait was painfully obvious. Much to Curdran's chagrin, though, Skyrie seemed to enjoy exploring every nook and cranny of Ironforge. More than anything, Curdran longed to escape Ironforge and fly with Skyrie, but a simple walk was all that the griffin could muster. The walks were usually a welcome distraction, but today his mind was racing with thoughts concerning Monimus's hammer. After Curdran had stormed out of the council meeting the day prior, Moira and Muradin had chosen a dark iron smith to reforge the hammer. The decision made Curdran's blood boil. Although in retrospect, he had only himself to blame for not being present to argue against the choice. His dislike for the Dark Iron clan ran deep, Betrayal and treachery seemed as ingrained in the Dark Iron's culture as griffins were in that of the Wildhammers. Sadly, sacrificing his scepter had done nothing to abate the tension in Ironforge. As Curdran walked, he felt the spiteful stares of passers-by gawking at his tawny, weathered skin, his fiery red ponytail, and his tattoos. Curdran knew that the glares went much deeper than just at his outward appearance. Ironforge was a clash of cultures, each one holding itself superior. The Wildhammers preferred living on the surface and soaring in the skies of the northern lands with their beloved griffins. The Bronzebeards preferred to dwell in the mountain as they always had. The Dark Irons lived even deeper in the shadows, their ways shrouded in. A steel-plated shoulder rammed into Curdran's side, jolting him away from his thoughts. He turned to see two Dark Irons carrying a large keg. The dwarf who'd bumped into him glared at Curdran with the glowing eyes common among the Dark Irons. They reminded Curdran of the demonic eyes he had seen on Outland. The Dark Iron grunted, and then he and his partner continued on their way. They were followed by a line of their clansmen divided into pairs, each carrying a keg. A strong odor wafted from the containers, which Curdran recognized as the smell of spirits brewed by the Dark Irons. The concoction wasn't like the ale he enjoyed. It was the type of drink that numbed the senses and made one forget after consuming only a glass. Curdran had seen groups of Dark Irons carrying kegs of the stuff throughout the city numerous times, apparently looking for something more potent than what Ironforge had to offer. "Curdran!" someone unseen said as the last of the keg-bearing Dark Irons passed. The voice was unmistakable, calm and regal in a practiced way. Curdran turned to see Moira approaching. Alongside her was a stout Dark Iron dwarf named Drukan, whom he observed accompanying Moira on many occasions. "Taking noble Skyri for a stroll, I see," she said with a polite smile. Curdran searched Moira's face for some sign that he would belie her cordially. He suspected that she and her Dark Irons were in some fashion responsible for the rumors circulating about the Wildhammer clan. It had, after all, been due to her aggressive actions. After Magnai's accident, she had held the city hostage with armed Dark Irons and had claimed the throne, that the Council of Three Hammers had been formed in the first place. The decision to reforge Monimus's hammer had also come at her behest. Yet time and again, Moira had proven to be Curdran's greatest ally in Ironforge. When complaints, in most cases unfounded, had been made about the Wildhammers, blaming them for food and housing shortages and the overcrowded Griffin Roost, she had defended his clan. But her apparent benevolence gave Curdran no satisfaction. "She needed to get away from the heat," Curdran said as he patted Skyri's leonine hindquarters. Moira stepped close to Skyri and raised her hand to the Griffin's beak. A magnificent creature. How is her condition? "Improvin'," Curdran lied, not wanting to discuss the matter with Moira any more than necessary. He was surprised that Skyri had been able to rise from her nest today. "I have a feeling she'll be good as new in no time," Moira said. She stroked Skyri's mane, and the Griffin lowered her head, cooing softly. Curdran had always known Skyri to be a good judge of character. The fact that she regarded Moira with such favor filled him with doubt about his suspicions concerning the Dark Iron leader. Moira glanced at Drukan, who stood farther back with a dour look on his face. "Come, Drukan, Skyri is a legend. She's faced dragons before. Did you know that?" "I didn't trust a beast that has a taste for dwarven blood," Drukan said, sneering. Moira's eyes grew wide in shock, and she stifled a laugh. "Don't be ridiculous." "That's what they say about the Wildhammer lands," Drukan said. "They feed their prisoners to the griffins. And Skyri here, well, the story goes she has more than her fill." Curdran felt his body flush with heat, and he took a step towards Drukan. "Watch your tongue, lad." "You know how these absurd rumors have been spreading," Moira said, placing her hand on Curdran's arm shoulder. "Drukan is, how should I say it, still learning the finer points of civility." She turned to Drukan, and her tone went malevolent. "Apologize." "But your highness, now." She glared at Drukan with a cold gaze that spoke more than words. "Begging your apologies," Drukan said to Curdran through clenched teeth. "Well, I don't mean to trouble you and Skyri," Moira said, her tone cordial once again. I merely wanted to say that your decision yesterday was one of great humility, something I've come to expect after hearing of your heroics on Outland. Reforging the hammer will bring unity, and it will be due to your decision that this unity comes to be. I'm not one of the dwarves out there who kind of think for themselves, Curdran said harshly. What's done is done. The Ironforge Harris simply smiled. Of course, I'll leave you and mighty Skyrie to your walk. He watched Moira and Druken as they went on their way, his moment of peace with Skyrie sullied by the interaction. He wanted Moira to be the enemy. That, at least, would make the confusion in Ironforge understandable. Yet Curdran felt with growing unease that he was searching for reason in a city that had abandoned any semblance of it. Let's get back to the roost, lass, Curdran said, and he tugged on Skyrie's wing. Curdran stood at his throne within the high seat, forcing himself to stay calm. It took all of his willpower to keep from lashing out at Belgrum, who was standing before the thrones. I take full responsibility for this, the advisor said, lowering his head in respect to Curdran and the other council members. The high seat was empty, save Belgrum and the 3 clan representatives. Even so, the old dwarf spoke in hushed tones. Between his words, a tense silence filled the room. Clutched in his hand was the parchment recounting the story of Monimus's hammer. It's a well-made piece of lies, Belgrum lifted the scroll and grimaced. After further scrutiny, it seems as though the parchment was aged with magic, and it was stuffed away in the record books. On the surface, nothing was a cause for concern. Nothing a cause for concern? Curdran said. One of me clan is dead. In case you forgot, one of me clan has died as well, Muradin reported. Wouldn't have to come to this if you would have given up your piece of the hammer in the first place. Are you deaf, lad? It isn't a piece of anything. Dina used that as an excuse. He didn't want this to begin with. Muradin, Curdran, please, Moira said, turning her attention to Belgrum. The reforging is a day away. You understand what this means, don't you? Aye, your highness, but the parchment is fake. I'd stake my life on it. Someone took a mighty effort to pass it off as real, but the script used doesn't match the other scrolls from the same period of time. So when did the pieces originate? Moira asked. For all we know, the Wildhammer Scepter and the Dark Iron Gem came about after the Civil War. The parchment described the damage on the Bronzebeard hammerhead in detail, which was how we found it. But knowing what we know now, there's no telling when it was damaged and put into the library. Who did this? Curdran grumbled. He wiped a fresh layer of sweat from his hairless scalp. Despite this hardy constitution, the stifling heat of the city was getting to him. Ugh, impossible to say. Many dwarves pass through the library each day, Belgrum reported. It matters not. We must go through with it, Moira said. Our fellow dwarves are expecting an act of unity. If this story comes to light and we cancel the reforging, they'll want someone to blame. Word of this does not leave this room, she added, fixing her gaze on Belgrum. The graying dwarf nodded. Curdran slammed his fist against the throne. I'll not give up something that rightfully belongs to me clan to keep this lie alive. It's not a lie to the city anymore, Muradin said, not after days of arguing about it. Much to this agitation, Curdran recognized the wisdom in Muradin's words. Discussion of the Monimus hammer had set the tension in Ironforge on an immovable path, like a roaring avalanche that would continue its course until the reforging, regardless of what the council said. Curdran sat in the griffin roost and mulled over the troubling situation. The truth of the Monimus hammer weighed heavily in his mind. He had hoped to take Skyrie for a walk and clear his thoughts, but she couldn't rise from her nest. She simply lay motionless, her breathing barely noticeable. Wildhammer Griffin riders sat near their winged companions, distraught over Skyrie's condition as well as the tense atmosphere in Ironforge. Even Eli's usually jovial demeanor was absent, and the Griffin tender lethargically raked bundles of straw in silence. Many of the Griffin riders, including Eli, were veterans of Outland. They had followed Curdran to Ironforge just as they had followed him to the Orcish homeworld, never questioning his decisions. For the first time in Curdran's life, he felt that he had led them into an unwinnable, pointless battle. Curdran rose and paced through the roost, as dark irons carrying wooden kegs began traversing the nest that stretched out into the walkway. The dark irons glared with their unsettling eyes at the seated wild hammers as they passed. One of the dark irons tripped on a stray pile of dry straw, sending a keg crashing to the ground. The wooden container cracked open, and a pale liquid gushed out into the roost. The fallen dark iron beat his fist against the ground and struggled to his feet. "Why do you wild hammers have to have your birds scattered out where we walk?" the dark iron said, and he spat on the nearest griffin. The creature squawked and swiped the edge of his nest with a talon, setting a clump of straw into the enraged dwarf's face. Eli stopped his work and calmly approached the dark iron. "It's not their fault, lad," he said in an even tone. "Your beasts haven't been nothing but a nuisance since they got here. As if having to dance around their dirty nest wasn't bad enough, I can smell their stench from the city's gates." The dark iron was seething. He cracked his knuckles and then took a step towards the nearby griffin. Both hands balled into fists. Eli instinctively thrust up his pitchfork toward the dark iron. "Didn't you lay a hand on the griffin, lad?" The dark iron's eyes widened at the sight of the pitchfork pointed at him. "You see this, lads?" he said to the other dark irons. "Wild hammer raising a weapon against us." Eli hastily lowered the pitchfork. "Didn't make this into something it's not." 5 griffin riders squatting close by rose to their feet. One of them stepped forward and jabbed his finger into the dark iron's armored chest. "Take the rest of your swill and be on your way," the wild hammer said. Curdran could sense it coming, the cauldron boiling up, its fiery contents rising higher and higher. After the troubling revelation about Martimus's hammer, a brawl was the last thing he needed to deal with. He walked towards the dark irons, hoping to avert the inevitable. "You wild hammers would see this city burned before harm ever came to these beasts," the dark iron roared, and then he turned to his companions. "Give 'em something to calm their nerves, lads." Without hesitation, 2 of the dark irons heaved their keg into the roost. It soared by Curdran's head and came crashing down next to Skyrie, spraying her and nearby griffins with dark iron spirits. Rage momentarily welled up inside of Curdran. He took a deep breath to regain his composure. He marched to the lead dark iron to send him and his clansmen on their way. At seeing Curdran, the dark iron took an involuntary step back, slipping on the straw and landing on the ground with a thud. Raucous laughter erupted from the griffin riders. "Just seeing Curdran scared the wee bam," one of them yelled. The dark iron glanced furtively at the ground, his face awash with humiliation. Finally he rose and stepped forward, inches away from Curdran. "Butterfly Thane, why do you go back and sit in the straw with the rest of the animals?" the dark iron growled. Then he spat in Curdran's face. The tiny force of the insult dislodged something in Curdran, something that had been lurking deep inside of him since he had come to Ironforge. The fleeting dream of seeing the skies above Airy Peak, his decision to give up on the heirloom, Skyrie's condition, everything exploded at once, blinding him with fury. Curdran's fist connected with the dark iron's head, sending the other dwarf off his feet. Without any order to do so, the wild hammers at Curdran's side charged forward. The dark irons hurled their kegs at the attackers, who expertly dodged and rolled out of harm's way. Loud squawks arose from the griffins as kegs landed throughout the roost, splintering against areas covered in only a thin layer of straw. Then the wild hammers and dark irons collided, clutching whatever limbs or armor they could grab. The groups pushed back and forth until the dark irons finally lost their balance and crashed into a nearby brazier. Fiery embers erupted from the iron container and caught a nearby mound of straw alight. The fire surged through the surrounding nests, fueled by the dark iron spirits. In seconds, the entire roost was aflame. Smoke billowed up toward the ceiling of the great forge. A number of griffins voiced shrill cries and took into the air, leaving a torrent of feathers, ash, and embers swirling below them. "Water!" Curdran roared, stepping over the pile of dwarves on the ground. From other parts of the great forge, dwarves began rushing toward the roost. Griffins were now circling in the shadowy recesses of the area, but 4 remained on the ground, 3 of them huddling around Skyrie and her nest. "Skyrie!" Curdran yelled. "Get out of there!" From her direction came a cry that made Curdran clench his eyes shut in pain. Was a sound he hadn't heard since Outland. A battle cry that had on many occasions been enough to send Skyrie's enemies fleeing in terror. Flames raged around her. Curdran could barely see Skyrie through the heavy smoke that covered the roost. One of the griffins at her side shot upward in a blur, leaving a trail of singed feathers in the air. The two other griffins rose as well, but they did not flee. They hover in the air with the talons on their forelegs clutching Skyree's wings, voicing brief caws to each other. In unison, the two griffins began boating their wings furiously, trying to lift Skyree off the ground, but she jerked herself free from the grasp of her kin. Dwarves started dousing the fire with kegs of water, while a newly arrived pair of gnomes in long flowing robes muttered incantations that sent crystals of ice over the roofs. However, continued to roar. Kurdran moved to strip off his armor, but in his state of shock he could do little more than fumble with the straps. He abandoned the idea and barreled towards the flames. "Kurdran!" Eli yelled. The griffin tender and two other wild hammers wrapped their arms around Kurdran's body. Even with three powerful dwarves clinging to him, Kurdran edged closer and closer to the flames. It took another two wild hammers to finally wrestle him to the ground. Pinned down, Kurdran could only watch as the two griffins near Skyree fled from the roost, the heat and smoke too much for them to bear any longer. After an agonizing few seconds, Skyree slumped to the ground. When the last burning embers had been extinguished, Eli and the other wild hammers released Kurdran, and he rushed into the smoldering roost. Skyree was there, motionless, blackened and smoking. A hand touched Kurdran's shoulder. I'm sorry," Eli said in a hoarse voice. Why'd she fight her kin? They were trying to save her." Kurdran muttered in disbelief. Of course, lad, she was protecting the eggs," Eli said suddenly. The two dwarfs carefully moved Skyree's body. Underneath, where three pristine eggs had once been, were scattered fragments of charred shells and half-cooked remains of Skyree's children. Kurdran stared at the grim sight, speechless. She tried," Eli said, and he knelt down in front of the blackened nest. The crowd was around the ruined griffin roost stood in silence. Even the dark irons, who had been partly responsible for the fire, seemed bewildered and at a loss for words. All eyes were on Kurdran. The smoke rolling around him was tinged with the smell of burnt flesh and straw, and he felt dizzy.